Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is also your host for this conversation. That's Dr. Bill O'Brien. And here he is, right now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. This is Bill O'Brien. It is a Tuesday. It is I believe, the 6th day of August in the year 2013. We welcome you to today's program. It is a beautiful day here. I trust that it is where you are as well. Let me tell you, for me, it is a beautiful day every day that we get together like this and that we spend some time sharing ideas and points of view about what I believe are some very, very significant issues. I think today, over the 2 hours, we're going to be looking at in some detail at Theodore Roosevelt. But we're not going to be talking about Theodore Roosevelt. Many people do that. There are books, there are biographies of Theodore Roosevelt, there are books about him, there are books about his foreign policy, about the idea of the big stick. There's a wonderful 3-volume biography that was just completed last year by Edmund Morris. Many of you remember the name Edmund Morris. The first notable biography that he wrote, I'm speaking then, I don't know. A significant biography that he wrote several years ago was a biography of Ronald Reagan. And it got a lot of attention and gave him a lot of visibility. And out of that, he came forward with what is reputed to be one of the finest 3-volume biographies ever written. I mean, it's great. And I had the privilege last year of going to Charleston and spending 2.5 hours in an audience along with several hundred other people listening to Edmund Morris off the top about Theodore Roosevelt. It was one of the most fascinating evenings that I've ever spent. So again, there's a lot of things you can go to a lot of places and find a lot of reputable, competent people who talk about Theodore Roosevelt. What I want to do today is look at Theodore Roosevelt as Theodore Roosevelt talks about Theodore Roosevelt, if that makes sense. That's what we're doing here. The website, in fact, before we went on the air, we were just having a conversation about the need for a website. I want to be able to post these documents ahead of time so that you folks who are out there can look at them ahead of time, can formulate questions. We can basically open up with questions or considerations, if we will, because I want people to know where we're going and what we're going to do. I think the issue is there are any number of places that you can go out there for information about Theodore Roosevelt, whether you focus on his domestic policy, his foreign policy, his personal characteristics, his exploits in the Spanish-American War and San Juan Hill, and Edmund Morris spends a lot of time in his last volume of the 3-volume biography talking about the character flaws in Theodore Roosevelt, and one of them, very honestly, is Theodore Roosevelt's obsession with manhood and war and aggressiveness and military prowess and all the rest of it, to the point that he forced his own sons into World War I. And when two of his sons were wounded and one was killed, and the way that he dealt with, Morris believes that in many ways Theodore Roosevelt was living his own dream life through his sons, and he was pushing his sons into things that he, for one reason or another, had never quite been able to do. It's very interesting, for example, that Morris points out, and I think a few textbooks make this point as well, that there was really some bad feeling between Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. It was personal. It wasn't just that they were campaign rivals in the election of 1912. There were some personal issues as well. One of the personal issues was that Theodore Roosevelt wanted in World War I Wilson to give him a military appointment to the European theater in World War I, and Wilson would not do it. And Roosevelt resented that tremendously. So there's an awful lot of very, very interesting stuff out there about Theodore Roosevelt. But I think that for people that don't have that much time, they can't, devote the next 6 months of their lives to a study of Theodore Roosevelt and do the same thing for many of the other people that we've been talking about here, the founders and various other folks. It seems to me the best option we have is to go to the source, is to go to the primary sources themselves and look at them and formulate and understand our own appreciation of these people. What this does is build a barrier, protect us from taking seriously the ideas of people who come at these issues and figures in history with a personal agenda. In other words, people who come to Theodore Roosevelt because they want to use Theodore Roosevelt or somebody like him to support a particular political point of view. I think that is very, very significant because if you've read Theodore Roosevelt and you've reflected and thought about his ideas and his positions on issues and things, then you can yourself recognize when somebody's coming at you with an agenda rather than an honest observation or consideration or possibility or looking for some sort of exchange or some sort of a response. There's one that's very valuable. In fact, I heard today, I mean, this is off the point, but it's I really wished it was in the car, and I really wished that I had a copy of this. I heard a commercial today, and it was just one of the most fantastic statements about conversation and the value of conversation and what it does. And basically, it was an advertisement. It was a commercial for Wells Fargo Financial. And basically, the whole idea was, come and let us begin a conversation about you and your financial future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But barring that part of the message, which is their agenda, their focus, the message itself, the way that they talked about the value of conversation was brilliant. And I encourage you to, if you have a moment and it occurs to you, to look for this and give it a listen and just see what you think about it. I thought it was fantastic. But anyway, conversation's the name of the game. It's not just a monologue here. At least that's the intent. We want conversation. We want dialogue. We want interaction and questions and disagreement if it's called for, and all of that. So we have a phone number that we can give you, and if you are inclined to give us a call, and we will put you on the air, and you can share your ideas and your perspective on some of these issues, not only with me but with our listeners. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you do want to communicate directly with me via email, my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And as I do every day before getting into the substance of today's program, I want to say, I don't necessarily say this every day, but I say it to myself every day, that what I hope going in is that at the end of this experience, at the end of this program, I can say that we did justice to the material and to the content. And I mean that. The one thing that I would not want to do is present ideas and information or reactions to information that detracted from the relevance of the substance of the content itself rather than added to it. And so, again, I think we owe it to those who lived our past and experienced it and faced its challenges to do the best job we can in trying for ourselves to discover and lift from the material, from the context, the essence of what these people, the essence of what these people were really about. So again, I say this little message to myself every day. At the end of today's program, I just hope that people have more an appreciation for what we covered than less. That's all I ask. And I look to you to keep me straight on that and hold me to that. We're going to look at Theodore Roosevelt and specifically his ideas of progressivism. We're going to look at what he said and why he said it and what he believes. I can say the reason for this is that most people, when they consider progressivism, they look at Theodore Roosevelt as kind of the consummate progressive. He wrote a lot, he spoke a lot, he conversed a lot, and in his position not only as President of the United States, but as candidate. And remember, Roosevelt was thrust into the White House with the assassination. He was the Vice President, and he was thrust into the White House with the assassination of the President, and ran for re-election and was re-elected. So he served out McKinley's first term, the rest of McKinley's term. Then he ran on his own and was reelected. And then in 1908, he turned the reins of the Republican Party over to William Howard Taft. And Taft was elected as president in 1908. Effectively, Taft pretty much emasculated many of the things that Roosevelt had started. And part of the issue is there's a total philosophical and political difference between the two men in a lot of different ways. And I don't mean by that Roosevelt is a progressive and William Howard Taft is a conservative. There's absolutely no question that William Howard Taft is one of the most underrated figures in American history. And I think part of that is because an awful lot of our history since World War II has been written, and there's absolutely no question, conservatives are right. Our story has been written since World War II from a liberal perspective for the most part. And what I mean is that the generation that came out of World War II, the generation that experienced the benefits of the New Deal ideas and programs of Roosevelt, the idea of the GI Bill after World War II, FHA, where people were allowed to pay, to borrow incredible amounts of money to own their own homes, with controlled, with highly controlled interest rates in order to make home ownership available to more people. The middle class that we talk about today all the time, that's being battered, not only by the recession, but by some of the changes and influence of the few, of corporate America and Wall Street in our tax policies and in the legislation that comes out of Washington. We talk all the time about how the middle class is being bashed and battered. The middle class we're talking about is the middle class that came into being after World War II, in large part as a result of Roosevelt's New Deal and Truman's success in enhancing that New Deal after World War II and what he called the Fair Deal. And basically, it was in many ways a continuation of the liberal philosophy which drove much of Roosevelt's New Deal program in the 30s and through the 40s. And Truman came in and inherited that program and basically carried it on. And, of course, the interesting thing is that when Dwight Eisenhower is elected as president in 52, even though he's elected as a Republican, he really accepts the basic principles which drove the New Deal. The recognition of labor's right to exist and organize and conduct or engage in collective bargaining and many of the things that came out of the New Deal. And there seems to be in fact, a consensus between Republicans and Democrats into the 50s about the basic tenets of the New Deal. By the time we get into the 1950s, these things are accepted, and we have what are called liberal Republicans, who basically advocate many of the same principles and many of the same ideas as the Democrats. And it is these liberal Republicans, it is this point of view that has primarily been the object of the conservative movement that sprang up in America in the 1970s and 1980s, in a large part in reaction to the left that got so much attention during the 1960s, and a lot of this is reaction to the civil rights movement, to the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, to the debacle that was Vietnam, and much of this, it seems to me, it produces a conservative response, which begins very, very hesitantly in the person of people like William Buckley, but as we know, the conservative movement continues to grow and becomes much more effective until by the time, when we elect Richard Nixon and then after that Ronald Reagan, it seems to me that conservatism is coming into its own. And one of the things that conservatives argue, and I think with some justification, is that much of our history is being written from a liberal consensus point of view, that the reality is that there's so much agreement between Democrats and Republicans about the liberal agenda, the New Deal programs that came out of the Roosevelt era, that many people argue that this is what they call consensus history. And they talk about, in the 1950s, they talk about a liberal consensus in America. And it's that liberal consensus that conservatives react against. And I think there's absolutely no question that there's some justification for that, because part of the liberal consensus is to squash conservatism and to basically assume that all ideas that come from the conservative side can be ignored or can be cast aside. And that's just not valid. That's just not true. It's not, basically, it's not the way the Republic is designed to work. It seems to me that if you believe in the principles of the free enterprise system and the marketplace of ideas and all the rest of those things, then basically every position, legitimate position, has a right to be heard. And if it is considered to be not legitimate, then it will disappear. I mean, that's the ideal. But if you believe in that, then the reality is the conservatives have a point, because many of their ideas are not even given the light of day, not even allowed to see the light of day. And I think that's very significant. I think the nation is in some ways paying for it. I think that the conservative movement has gone way beyond the limits of legitimacy. This is my own feeling. I think that the emergence of the Tea Party and what it is doing to the Republican Party is obviously a significant story in itself today. I think we just experienced in the recent election last year the trials and tribulations of Mitt Romney, who grew up as the son of a relatively bright liberal Republican. George Romney, prominent businessman, head of American Motors. Many of you remember that company. And in the tradition of republicanism, which came out of World War II, which came out of the Eisenhower era of republicanism, and yet we saw Mitt Romney struggle with the idea that he was heading a party that was not interested in anything that he had to say. So basically, he was trying to maintain his liberal Republican roots at the same time that he was trying to maintain his role, his titular role as head of a Republican Party, which was out of tune with what he believed. And it's becoming very clear, the new history of the election of the 2012 election by Dan Baltz that was just published in the last couple of weeks makes this point that Mitt Romney really didn't have much of a chance. And the question is, is the extreme conservatism which has taken over the control of the Republican Party, has it become strong enough to condemn republicanism to permanent minority status within the American two-party system? Because there's no question, and I'm one who believes this very firmly, each party needs the other one. There's a reciprocal relationship between both of them, and one needs the other. And so I think, I think this is a very considered issue that all of us will be confronting as the weeks and months unfold in the future, and as we move towards the election, the next election in 2016. But anyway, I don't want to get off on that tangent. I want to stay to the period in the period of progressivism. And basically, yesterday we were talking a little bit about Woodrow Wilson, because I think one must recognize that even though Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat and even though Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican, the fact of the matter is they were both progressives. I think one of the disservices that our education system plays on students traditionally in American history is that students have been asked over and over again for years and years and years to focus on the progressivism of Wilson and Roosevelt and basically compare and contrast the two. And students have been absolutely befuddled in their efforts to try to find differences as well as similarities between the two. And it seems to me that assignment itself is a little bit out of whack, because the implication is, since both candidates ran against each other from different parties, that there must be substantive differences between them. And there are differences, there's no question. But I can remember myself answering essay questions as a student. Compare Roosevelt's new nationalism with Wilson's new freedom in terms of both the positive and the negative aspects. And the challenge of trying to separate and distinguish the ideas of the new freedom and the new nationalism. The only thing that I've finally come to the conclusion on that issue is that it seems to me that there's much more political rhetoric associated with the two terms than there is substantive difference. It seems to me that there's much more similarity than difference between the two. But on the other hand, the candidates themselves have to argue and make the point that there's a major difference between the two. In other words, each candidate has to talk to the voters and say, it's really important you vote for me and not him. Because if I win, this is what's going to happen. If he wins, that's what's going to happen. And so the candidates themselves are making it appear that there are major differences between the two. And I would argue, after wrestling with this off and on for over a number of years, I've come to the conclusion that most of the differences are merely political rhetoric, and that really the substantive similarities between the two positions define the two men as progressives. And I think, I hope that what I'm suggesting about the two today, and what I mentioned yesterday about Wilson, will fall into that frame of reference. Wilson spends a lot of time reflecting on the proper role of government in the face of some of the problems that America faces in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And when Wilson is selected to run for president, he is a progressive, and he has bought into the idea that government has an absolutely critical responsibility to do something about many of the problems that the nation faces. Rural America, urban America, labor, farms, the economy, the cities, the slums, crime, unregulated corporate America, unregulated business. And we have this whole group of what I referred to yesterday, and this is Peter Finley Dunn's term, muckrakers, the idea that these populist journalists are digging up dirt about some of the most evil things that happen are happening in society and in corporate America. Diseased meat, the background, the justification for the creation of a government agency called the Pure Food and Drug Administration is based on the idea that people are buying drugs, people are taking medicine, and they have no idea what they're taking. There are no controls. The industry, the pharmaceutical industry, has no control over what people produce. Everybody's marketing everything. And all you have to do is think about the old black and white cowboy and western movies about the wagon that would pull into the western towns with the huckster who would set up a tent and stand on the in the back of the wagon and start to basically offer this elixir that would cure everything. It would make you, it makes you more sexually active, and it would cause you to be handsome, and it would grow hair, and it would do all of this stuff, and people were buying it. That's what the nation was dealing with. And so Wilson and Roosevelt both began to recognize that the only thing, the only agency, the only entity in American society that has a chance to do something positive about these things is government. So Wilson and Roosevelt both come up with a strategy or a rationale to justify and explain why government regulation, government management, government control, and government power are the answers to these kinds of challenges. The alternative is chaos. And, of course, in the background, you've got labor violence, you've got the Populist Party, you've got that radical populist agenda or platform for the election of '92. You're seeing the working poor in cities and farms. You're seeing racial efforts to unite and organize politically and take over legitimately. I mean, this is going back to James Madison's idea of the majority faction. The nation is facing a crisis. And it's very, very interesting because we covered this before. I thought about reconstituting this document again today, but I didn't want to do that. But if you remember Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, in which Andrew Carnegie was talking to the wealthy people in America, and he was talking about the responsibilities of wealth. And what he was basically saying is that the well-to-do, the people who do well in our society, have a responsibility to give back to the community. And inherent in his argument was a warning. And his warning is, if we become, we meaning the wealthy, if we allow ourselves to become part of the problem rather than part of the solution, if we continue to exploit the exploitable, the working poor, immigrants, blacks, minorities, women, and all the rest of it, our employees, if we continue to exploit the downtrodden, then the downtrodden will have no option except to organize, and ultimately we'll lose the whole ball game. So it's not a misnomer for Carnegie's message to be called the gospel of wealth. He was basically appealing to the wealthy that if you don't take care of these people and you don't do something to temper and soften the horrendous conditions that millions and millions of Americans and immigrants are being asked to live under, if we don't do something, then they have no option except to take matters into their own hands. And what we will face is either revolution, or if we don't do what needs to be done, government will do it. And if we want to keep government out of the equation, what that means is we need to find ways to solve these problems ourselves, because if we don't, the public demand for government intervention is going to be so strong that we'll not be able to do anything to refute it. So, in a sense, Andrew Carnegie predicts progressivism. And if you understand the whole nature of free enterprise, the whole nature of the republic, it's really not hard. Because the options are pretty obvious, are pretty clear. What Carnegie is basically doing is appealing to the common sense of the wealthy. And said that you are experiencing tremendous success in this system. If you want to preserve that system, then you have to find a way to give back. Because if you don't, the people on the bottom continue to be ground up and ground up. There's only so long you can do that before they react. They're reacting in labor strikes. They're reacting in agriculture, in farmer movements, and farmer radicalism. They're reacting philosophically in documents like the platform of the Populist Party, the 1892 platform. And basically what they're suggesting is government ownership of everything. If we want to preserve free enterprise, if we want to preserve the system that allowed us to be so successful, we better do something. Because if we don't, government's going to come in and do it. And if government doesn't come in and do it, it's going to be because we have a revolution and the whole system will be down the tubes anyway. So Carnegie's a very, very important document. His Gospel of Wealth document, 1880, I think it's 1886 or 1888 that he writes that. So Woodrow Wilson's philosophy, political philosophy, his political writings and his political speeches, basically what you see in Wilson's political speeches is the gradual evolution of a philosophy of progressivism, which he, in the campaign of 1912, ends up calling the New Freedom. What he's basically talking about is a much more interventionist, activist government whose number one priority is to preserve opportunity for everybody in the American experience. And Wilson believes that since bigness in corporate America, in railroads, in finance, since bigness and power have destroyed opportunity for other people, then government's primary responsibility is to penalize business success. In other words, when a business becomes too big to compete with, when everything that we associate with free enterprise becomes impossible because the size and the influence of government. When a corporation, for example, I'm using just one example, you could talk about US Steel, you could talk about some of the railroads, you could talk about Andrew Carnegie himself, you could talk about Carnegie's empire in steel. You can talk about one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in the 1890s is the case of E.C. Knight, and it's about the sugar monopoly in America, the Sugar Trust, where one corporation, one company, controls as much as 93% of all the sugar produced, imported, and produced in the United States. So effectively, they are controlling the price. They set the price. And anybody that tries to market sugar in competition with them, they can wipe out. They can manipulate price. They can undersell their competition. They can sell at a loss for a short period of time until they drive competition out of the market. And so this becomes a Supreme Court case. And the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 is passed by Congress. And basically the Sherman Antitrust Act is that when a particular corporation or organization becomes so powerful that it ends up being, and this phrase is exactly from the legislation, being in restraint of trade. In other words, when a company becomes so big and so powerful that it is inhibiting commerce rather than encouraging or promoting or expanding commerce, then government has the responsibility to break that corporation up. That philosophy as expressed in the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, is effectively what Wilson buys in his definition of new freedom. And he wants government to be going around constantly investigating, constantly checking and studying and collecting data and making determinations when corporations or particular entities become so big and so powerful that they begin to restrain trade. Then government's responsibility is to break it up and, effectively, I'm using the old game of Monopoly here, but effectively force everybody to go back to go and start all over again. Roosevelt's position in what he calls the new nationalism is a little bit different than that, but it's not really that different overall. Wilson's argument is that there are good trusts and bad trusts. I mean, some bigness is good. Some of it's bad, but some of it's good. And so Roosevelt's position is that what we need is a government that has the power to manage and regulate and control bigness in order to make sure that bigness becomes goodness. In other words, government has to have the power to force the bad big corporations and companies to behave according to the rules. And so, from Roosevelt's perspective, government's job is to manage and regulate, not just to go in and break up because a company becomes too big. Roosevelt makes the point, for example, in response to Wilson, that his position is that bigness is not necessarily badness. And he points out that Wilson is basically arguing that if a company or an entity becomes so big and so powerful, the mere fact that it inhibits trade makes it bad. And Roosevelt's position is that you're throwing out, you're effectively throwing out the baby with the bathwater there, because you're interfering with businesses that are positives as well as businesses that are negative. That's the difference. But what I wanted to focus on, and what we addressed yesterday in preparation for a much more detailed look at Theodore Roosevelt, is Wilson's idea of the new role, of the new definition of the state as, in a much more paternalistic role. Wilson's whole rationale for progressivism, and again, he is an authority on American government. He is a political scientist. He has a Ph.D. in political science. He became president of Princeton University. He authors one of the best studies of the British political system ever produced. And he believes so strongly in the British system that he commits himself to the idea that we have to begin to adopt many of the features of that system. So Wilson's idea is that we need to go back to the paternalism of the colonial period and the early national period in the Republic. We need to go back to a period when the general consensus was that what we need to do is get the people with the right talent and the right abilities into the right positions. And I used the term yesterday because it's a term that John Adams used all the time, the idea of a natural aristocracy. But it's based on the premise that everybody is not equally capable of doing the job well. And what we need to do is get the right people into the right positions and give them the authority to make the decisions. We want the most competent people to make the decisions that matter. And that's what people want, and that's what our political system is about, is allowing these people to stand before the public and make their case and let the public, the voter, decide who best represents the best chance. But it's all based on the assumption that government, by definition, must adopt and employ a very paternalistic role. That government is going to be principally responsible for the environment in which business happen, in which farmers farm, in which people work, in which students study. And the whole idea is that maintaining the proper environment for all of this to happen is the ideal. And Wilson believes that over time we allowed ourselves to be victimized by a philosophy. We allowed ourselves to be sold a bill of goods that unregulated free enterprise, something resembling what the history books refer to as social Darwinism, is the best way to go. That corporations will produce the most and individual freedom will flourish more than anything else within a system which government does not regulate or control or involve itself in. In other words, the less government we can have, the more freedom people will have. And the whole idea is, and of course they are using Darwin's research in nature to justify this, Darwin's idea is that within nature, the struggle for existence produces winners and losers, but more than anything else, it drives progress. The reason there is progress in nature is because the process of competition and survival of the fittest is allowed to happen. So in society, those who buy into or use Darwin's ideas try to apply his scientific research to society economy. And their basic argument is that the best thing we can do is model our nation, our economy, our political system after nature. There's no model that's better than nature itself. So the idea is that we really need to keep government out and limit government because government is the greatest threat to individual freedom, and our system flourishes on unrestricted individual freedom. So Wilson believes that over time we have allowed ourselves to fall hook, line, and sinker for that philosophy. We have become victims, prisoners of an economic philosophy. And his point would be that the whole purpose of economic philosophy is to be debated and discussed and weighed against alternative philosophies. But in America, what we've done is we've bought the whole package, and we've made it impossible for competing theories or ideas to even see the light of day. And the result is that what we are seeing in the Industrial Revolution are the worst aspects of an unregulated society and an unregulated economy, which he feels are the product of a government that has allowed itself to become impotent. And what Wilson is talking about is that government must assume the role of the parent, the same role that the natural aristocracy, so-called, performed in the colonial period and the early national period. His argument is the challenges are greater, the situation is more drastic, there are all of these threats. Human life is becoming less and less predictable and less secure. There are too many people who have nothing to lose by breaking the law and becoming desperate. We have the makings here of explosion all over the place in our society. We have labor violence. We're using troops to put down riots and strikes and various other things. And that ultimately what we've got to have is a government that people can trust and a government that people can have faith in. People need to be able to believe. People need to be able to trust the fact that if they are in trouble, government will come in and fix it. They don't need to take matters into their own hands. We cannot maintain a civil society in the modern day and age when the only law that prevails is vigilante law. If you're thinking about the recent situation in Florida with Trayvon Martin, think about that legislation, because we may be headed back in that same direction. But that's Wilson's position, and he basically makes the case that in the modern industrial world that is moving more and more into global commerce, and must move into global commerce for industrialism to be effective and to happen, there's a much more pronounced need for government management and government relation and people's willingness to trust government to control the environment and make sure that everybody has a chance. And that's progressivism. Keep in mind that this whole philosophy is in response to the philosophy which drives the populist platform of 1892, which is an example. In that philosophy, they're talking about the people taking back power. What Wilson's talking about is the people who currently have power must use the control of government to fix the system and respond to the problems that exist in our society. Otherwise, the system will implode. And there's nobody that articulates that philosophy, I believe, better than Theodore Roosevelt. One of my closest colleagues and friends is a political scientist. And about a year ago, I shared with him via email. I sent him an attachment to an email, which was Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech of 1912. And he was blown away. He could not believe. He said, I read it, and I read it, and I read it, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It is so relevant. It is so contemporary. It is so complete. It seems to touch every significant base. It articulates a position. It defines progressivism and basically articulates a positive progressive position. And his concern is that in today's world, for the most part, progressives have allowed conservatives to define progressivism rather than progressives defining it for themselves. There's absolutely no question that the vitriol of our political debate in this country with talk radio and the extreme positions that some of these people take, progressivism has been knocked back on its heels to the point that it is allowing its opponents to define it. And what my colleague and friend pointed out is that Theodore Roosevelt articulates and defined a role for progressivism that today's progressives must see and read. It's something that everybody needs to read, he points out, because we're not hearing it from any of our so-called progressive leadership. But keep in mind that progressivism is not radicalism. Radicalism is committed to revolutionary change. Radicalism talks about altering or changing the system, reflecting and readdressing the way that goods and services are distributed in this society. We're talking about the redistribution of wealth. But we're talking about regulation, government regulation of business, but we're talking about the regulators being the customers or the consumers. We're talking about the masses of the people controlling government. The example which makes this point better than any is a very simple one. We know that in every single state, there is some state agency, some public service commission, or whatever you want to call it, that hears utility appeals for rate increases. utilities, because they engage in the public interest, utilities cannot just impose a fee increase or an increase in rates. They must have that rate approved by government, by state government. And in theory, the Public Service Commission represents the public, the public interest. And its job is to weigh the request for a rate increase against the ability of the people to pay it. And very honestly, it almost becomes a predictable game. The utilities request more than they need because they know that the Public Service Commission is going to come back and give them only a portion of what they ask for. So they ask for more than they need. I mean, it's such basic logic that it's not even worth discussing. And so many people believe that the Public Service Commission was created to protect the public interest against being gouged by private corporations, in this case utilities. But the fact of the matter is, if you read the Populist Party platform of 1892, their approach to the regulation of utility rates would be to put me on the Public Service Commission. Believe me, if I and people who agreed with me sat on a Public Service Commission in any state, the utilities would not get the rate increases that they've demanded. But the fact is, most utilities, most of the time, are getting the rate increases they want. So the fact of the matter is that these public service commissions are either doing their job by fairly balancing and weighing the interests of the public against the needs of the company, the corporation, or their existence is primarily a way to convince citizens that their interests are being represented in government. In other words, maybe these public service commissions, the people who sit on these commissions, most of whom are appointed by governors or state legislatures, most of them have backgrounds in the utilities. And of course, the logic of the thing makes perfect sense. You don't put somebody on an agency to regulate railroads unless you know something about the business of running a railroad. So who better knows the business of running a railroad than people who come from that industry? Whether they be corporate attorneys that specialize in railroad and transportation legislation or whatever. So the fact of the matter is, most of the people that sit on these public agencies, regulatory agencies, come from the industries that they are regulating. So the debate really comes down to whether these agencies are independent brokers who are honestly representing the interests of the public at large against the private sector, or whether, in fact, they are agencies whose mere existence is primarily to justify rate increases. In other words, the public doesn't have to deal with the corporations or the utilities don't have to deal with the outcry from customers if they go through government to get what they want. If there's any flack to be caught, it's being caught by the government agencies, not the companies. We got about 5 minutes left in this first hour. So let me just make this point. I think this is an incredible story. In the 1950s, there was an American historian whose name was Gabriel Kolko, Kolko. And Gabriel Kolko was doing research for his PhD at Harvard. He was a graduate student on the origins of railroad regulation during this period, the progressive period as a whole. And what he found in his research And what he wrote in his dissertation, which was entitled The Triumph of Conservatism, is that while the general public impression was that progressivism, the story of progressivism, is the story of government coming to the rescue of people who are being victimized by private corporations, what Gabriel Kolko argued, that if you look at the data, most of the agencies, the government agencies that were being created, were designed by and supported by the very industries that they were being created to regulate. That, in other words, the real story of progressivism is not the plight of the people demanding government support. The real story of progressivism is the industries themselves recognizing that in order to pacify the people, we have to create the illusion that government is really the honest broker that is protecting their interest. So that many of these agencies are created to stand between the consumer and corporate America. But for the most part, they are being staffed by people whose entire background comes from the company or the industry that is being regulated. So Kolko's argument is that we have totally reversed, we have the story of progressivism totally backwards. That progressivism is really the story of corporate America responding to the extremes of populists and organized labor in the late 19th century. And that progressivism is really the introduction of government into the equation, primarily at the behest of the corporations and the companies and the industries themselves, that the people are demanding that they be regulated by government. And that all of this is an alternative to the populist position, which is that you create regulatory agencies and you put the customers in the agencies, not the companies. My story, with 3 minutes left in this hour. Gabriel Kolko's dissertation was rejected by the history department at Harvard. It was in the 1950s, and Kolko's position was considered to be un-American. Of course, this was the height of the McCarthy era. It was the height of the Cold War. It was considered to be un-American to even suggest this particular explanation of philosophy, of the origins of progressivism. And Gabriel Kolko was required to go elsewhere to get his doctorate approved. He eventually did. I can't remember offhand where he got it. And his dissertation was published under the title Triumph of Conservatism. And basically his whole perspective is that the progressive movement is not really a victory of the people enlisting the aid of government. Progressivism is really the story of the industries being created, creating the middleman, which they see as necessary to pacify the demands of the American consumer and the American people as a whole. The reason I mention this is because every single textbook in American history that you pick up that does anything with progressivism will now introduce this as legitimate historical fact. Kolko's position received such incredible animus. People were so opposed, it was almost like Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution all over again. And committed historians went to the well, determined to prove that Kolko was wrong. And they weren't able to do it. Because there's too much evidence that progressivism is not a victory of American radicals over conservatives. Progressivism is really a moderate form of conservatism designed to control, and arrest radicalism. And that perspective is now considered so pervasive and so legitimate that it is in many of the textbooks. But the fact of the matter is, it's in there in a paragraph that usually is written in such a way that students really don't pick up what they're reading. And instructors rarely go into this, because to do so would put them in the same category, as you will, as Gabriel Coco was in the 1950s. So that's my thesis. This is the way I look at progressivism. This is the way I look at Theodore Roosevelt. And when we come back, after we'll pause for a 4 or 5 minute break. After we come back, we're going to look at Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech in some detail. And we're going to basically draw our own conclusions as to how Roosevelt defines the role for government in what we call progressivism. And if Roosevelt is the consummate progressive, then his explanation of what it is ought to be something that we can all take to the bank, so to speak. And that's where we're going in our second hour. Let's pause for 4 or 5 minutes and take a break and stretch and reflect a little bit on some of this stuff, because I think it's incredibly important. And I thank you, and I invite you to stay tuned. After a 4 or 5 minute break, we'll be right back with more Virtual Center of the Study for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. Please stay with us.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob. Bob Kincaid. This is Bill O'Brien. This is the second hour of today's program, brought to you by the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. We invite you to share your thinking and your ideas with our audience. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. We would love to hear from you. In fact, now would be a good time before we get into something else, because I know a number of you of emails have said that you really are a little bit reluctant to call in the middle of the program or the middle of a topic or something like that. But it seems to me that the break that we have at the top of the hour is a wonderful opportunity to react or to share your ideas or to kind of think out loud for the benefit of other people as well. So the number to do that is area code 304-658-3333. If you'd like to email me directly and share your ideas and your thinking on this, by all means, I would love to hear from you. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, I-E-N, on O'Brien, at gmail.com. So, for those of you just joining, welcome. Welcome. For those of you who've been with us through our first hour, thank you for staying with us. What we have done is kind of laid the background, the context, for the speech that Theodore Roosevelt delivers, which is usually referred to as his New Nationalism speech. It's delivered in Osawatomie, Kansas. The audience, which I think is very significant because he makes reference to the audience throughout the document, are the veterans, the Union veterans of the Civil War, the so-called Grand Old Army, and he's making specific reference to them. And so, with that, the first portion of his speech is directed directly to them. And basically, what he talks about to them is the fact that the Civil War. He basically makes the point that there were two critical periods in America's existence. One was the independence itself, and the second one was the challenge to the Union, which was resolved by his audience, by the Grand Old Army, with the Union victory in the Civil War. And then he looks at slavery, and he's specifically looking at Abraham Lincoln. And he basically is making the point to them that the consistency of the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence required the Civil War, that the abolition of slavery and the commitment to freedom and the commitment to citizenship and equality, as reflected in the Civil War amendments, that the Civil War produces, eliminates the hypocrisy that existed in America from the time of independence up until the Civil War itself. His argument is that in spite of the violence and all the negatives of the war, the fact is that its outcome was necessary for the future and the benefit of the nation. And his position, the context that he's making to this audience, is that just as you legitimize the Declaration of Independence by what you did in the Civil War, what I'm doing as President of the United, what I want to do as President of the United States is to redefine the role of government in such a way that I can do for the nation the same kinds of necessary things that you did in the Civil War. And that's his justification, that this is merely the latest chapter in an ongoing saga of America's determination and challenge to strike the proper balance between freedom and responsibility, between the rights of the individual and the responsibilities of the individual, between the opportunities available to people and the necessary role for government in preserving those opportunities for everybody in the face of those few who would take their positions of power and use them to destroy opportunity for everybody else. And his argument is the only way that we can combat that reality is by redefining the role for government. And then in his speech, he goes to Abraham Lincoln himself. And I think these are very significant because he includes, in his speech, he addresses 3 or 4 statements from Lincoln which seem to set up the message that he wants to bring about his approach to government, that which we call progressivism. And he basically begins with this quote from Lincoln. I hold, this is Lincoln talking, I hold that while man exists, it is his duty to improve not only his own condition, but to assist in ameliorating mankind, unquote. So Roosevelt is going back to the source, to Lincoln. And he's basically addressing Lincoln's statement that man's responsibility is not only to improve his own position as an individual, but to do everything he can to assist others as well. Kind of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. And then Roosevelt continues and said, and again, and here's another quote from Lincoln, labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. Unquote. That's Abraham Lincoln. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. And then Roosevelt says this, which I think is incredible, and this is a quote from Roosevelt. If that remark was original with me, I should be even more strongly denounced as a communist agitator than I shall be anyhow. It is Lincoln's. I am only quoting it. And that is one side That is the side the capitalist should hear. Now, let the working man hear his side. And then he goes back to Lincoln again. Capital has its rights, which are as worthy of protection as any other rights. Nor should this lead to a war upon the owners of property. Property is the fruit of labor. Property is desirable. It's a positive good in the world, unquote. Abraham Lincoln. What has Roosevelt done? He has created, in the minds of his audience, a situation where he has legitimized, and he has done it in a way which is brilliant because he's gone back to Abraham Lincoln, whom everybody loves, and he's talking about the rights of labor, but then he's also talking about the rights of property, the rights of capital. And the only logical conclusion to draw from that is that what Roosevelt is suggesting is that if each side is at loggerholds with the other, and each side has the right to exist and to be protected and defended and supported, then by inference, who can do that? Somebody's got to be the honest broker. Somebody's got to basically weigh the interests of both sides and decides what's best for the nation as a whole. And, of course, what he's doing is setting up government. And then he goes to one more quote from Lincoln, which is this: "Let not him who is houseless," let me repeat that, "let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him work diligently and build one for himself, thus by example assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built." That's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. It is obviously a statement that we must find an alternative to one side pulling down the house of another. We have got to figure out a way to get people to build the house, their own house for themselves, rather than seeing things as a situation where in order to get what I want, I've got to take it from somebody else. What a brilliant play on four significant quotations from Abraham Lincoln to make his case for what he's going to define as the new nationalism. And now I'm quoting directly from Roosevelt's speech. "In every wise struggle for human betterment, one of the main objects, and often the only object, has been to achieve a large measure of equality of opportunity. In the struggle for this great end, equality of opportunity, nations rise from barbarism to civilization, and through it, people press forward from one stage of enlightenment to the next. One of the chief factors in progress is the destruction of special privilege. The essence of any struggle for healthy liberty has always been and must always be to take from some one man or class of men the right to enjoy power or wealth or position or immunity which has not been earned by service to his or their fellows. That's what you guys," he doesn't say you guys, he said that's what you fought for in the Civil War, and that's what we strive for now. Basically, what Roosevelt is saying to these people is that what we need is to get back on track to really find a way to create equality of opportunity in this society. And the only way to do it is to take special privilege out of the equation. We have got to find a way to make sure that people, certain people, don't have an advantage over other people. That makes equality of opportunity a sham. What we have got to do is take from those who have earned special positions of power, wealth, position, or immunity that they have not earned by service to his or their fellows. And when by we have to do this, he's of course talking about government. And he goes on. At many stages in the advance of humanity, this conflict between the men who possess more than they have earned and the men who have earned more than they possess is the central condition of progress. What a beautiful sentence. Tell me that this man cannot write. At many stages in the advance of humanity, this conflict between the men who possess more than they have earned and the men who have earned more than they possess is the central condition of progress. This conflict. In our day, he says, it appears as the struggle of freemen gain and the right of self-government as against the special interests, who twist the methods of free government into machinery for defeating the popular will. Special interests have special, by definition, special interest means special control and access to government, which gives them the ability to twist free government into a mechanism for defeating the popular will. At every stage, Roosevelt says, and under all circumstances, the essence of the struggle is to equalize opportunity, destroy privilege, and give to the life and citizenship of every individual the highest possible value both to himself and to the Commonwealth. At every stage and under all conditions, circumstances, always, the essence of the struggle is to equalize opportunity, destroy privilege, and give life to the citizenship of every individual. That's nothing new, he says. All I ask in civil life is what you fought for in the Civil War. He's talking to this audience of veterans. All I ask in civil life is what you fought for in the Civil War. You fought for people's right to have a chance. And that's all we're about. That's all we stand for in politics, he says. Practical equality of opportunity for all citizens, he says. When we achieve it, we'll have two great results. First, every man will have a fair chance to make of himself all that in him lies, to reach the highest point to which his capacities, unassisted by special privilege of his own and unhampered by the special privilege of others, can carry him, and to get for himself and his family substantially what he has earned. Second, the second great result of this, equality of opportunity means that the Commonwealth will get from every citizen the highest service of which he is capable. No man who carries the burden of the special privileges of another can give to the Commonwealth that service to which it is fairly entitled. What is Roosevelt talking about here? My God, what a sentence, what a paragraph when you think about it. The results of bringing equality of opportunity to everybody will have two great results. The first one will be to give every individual the opportunity to go as far as his own talents and abilities will take him, because we are taking special privilege out of the equation. We are going to make sure that wherever everybody ends up, it's based on their own talents and willingness to work and skills. It's not due to the fact that some people have an unfair advantage over other people because of who they are or who they know or how much money they have or any of the other stuff. So the one great advantage of practical equality of opportunity for all citizens is the benefit to the individual citizen himself. This one is the one I want to emphasize. Equality of opportunity means that the Commonwealth, now remember, we are the government, and we have a responsibility to promote the general welfare. So we have to be concerned about the whole society, not just certain individuals within it. Equality of opportunity means that the Commonwealth will get from every citizen the highest service of which he is capable. No man who carries the burden of the special privileges of another can give to the Commonwealth that service to which it is fairly entitled. The only way that the public good can derive the benefit which it has a right to from every citizen is by making sure that every citizen has an equal chance. If you get to a particular position because of special privilege that you have, there's no way that we, the society at large, can get all we're entitled to because you didn't commit everything you have to the game. You brought in extra, outside influences and privileges to help you. So if you reach your position of success because of special privilege, the community only receives a portion of what we have a right to expect from you. But if every citizen gets an equal shot, then the community will realize everything that it has a right to expect from everybody. What Roosevelt is saying here, that government does not represent special interests or certain groups of people. Government's job is to represent everybody, the Commonwealth. And then he comes to his very famous word, the square deal. And he said, I stand for a square deal. But when I say that I'm for a square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game. This is very important. When I call for a square deal, he says, I don't just mean that everybody needs a fair shot under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service. This is important. What Roosevelt is saying is that when he talks about a square deal, he's not talking about a level playing field. He's talking about doing whatever we need to do in order to make sure that everybody has an equal shot. He is rejecting the idea that a level playing field gives everybody the same opportunity. And the reason for that is because of the special privileges that some people bring to the table. So our job is not to ensure a level playing field. Our job is to make sure that everybody gets a fair chance in the competition. One word of warning, he said, which I think is hardly necessary in Kansas. When I say I want a square deal for the poor, I do not mean that I want a square deal for the man who remains poor, because he has not got the energy to work for himself. If a man who has had a chance will not make good, then he's got to quit. And you men of the Grand Army, you want justice for the brave man who fought and punishment for the coward who shirked his work. Is that not so? So basically what he's saying is, we are not about doing for the doers. We are about creating an environment where everybody has a chance to do for themselves. And if people refuse to do for themselves, that's their problem. He goes on. Now this means that our government, national and state, must be freed from the sinister influence or control of special interests. If we're going to do this, then we have got to find a way to free government at all levels from the influence of the special privileges. Exactly as the special interests of cotton and slavery threatened our political integrity before the Civil War, So now the great special business interests too often control and corrupt the men and methods of government for their own profit. We must drive the special interests out of politics. This is one of our tasks today. Every special interest, and this is key, I've circled this in my copy. Every special interest is entitled to justice, full, fair, and complete. And now, mind you, if there were any attempt by mob violence to plunder and work harm to the special interest, whatever it may be, that I most dislike, and the wealthy man, whomsoever he may be, for whom I have the greatest contempt, I would fight for him. And you would if you were worth your salt. He should have justice. For every special interest is entitled to justice, but no one is entitled to a vote in Congress, to a voice on the bench, or to representation in any public office. The Constitution guarantees protection to property, and we must make that promise good, but it does not give the right of suffrage to any corporation. This paragraph is critical because what Roosevelt is saying here is we need to get rid of the special interests in order that we can begin to move towards something called equality of opportunity for everybody. But in the process of getting rid of the special interests, we must recognize that they too have a right to justice and fairness. And then he talks about mob violence. He's talking about radicalism. And he said they have a right to not be subjected to violence. And even though I dislike them and I feel the greatest contempt for them, I would fight for them if their right to justice was being violated. So what is he talking about here? What kind of a role is he talking about for government? He's talking about the idea of government as the honest broker. Government as the decision maker that weighs the interests of both sides of different interests and makes the decision as what's best for the community as a whole. He is basically creating an environment, an approach to government, which is giving government the right to define the public interest. Not the corporations, but not labor unions either. Not the corporate executive, but not the working man either. By definition, what he's saying is, if you are in one group or the other group, then you have a special interest. You have your own agenda. You have your own self-interest. We can't allow your self-interest to prevail, because if it does, it'll be at the expense of the alternative, the other interests. The only way that we can make this work is to make sure that no special interest makes the decision. And by implication, what that means is government must make it. So what Roosevelt is doing is defining a role for government here as the definer of the public interest. We will make the decision. If working people take law into their own hands and become vigilantes and engage in mob violence, we'll shoot them. But that doesn't mean we're anti-labor. That means we're pro-American freedom and pro-American liberty, because we would take the same stand against the other side. What we need here in order for this to work is a new, objective, unbiased power. And that power must be government. And in order to get it, we have got to get the special interests out of the equation. Roosevelt goes on, the true friend of property, the true conservative, is he who insists that property shall be the servant and not the master of the Commonwealth. Right here, Roosevelt is defining the progressive as a true conservative. The true friend of property, the person who really supports the property rights, the true conservative, Roosevelt says, is the person who insists that property shall be the servant and not the master of the Commonwealth, who insists that the creature of man's making shall be the servant and not the master of the man who made it. The citizens of the United States must effectively control the mighty commercial forces which they have called into being. The only way to control these interests and these special powers is with a greater power, and that has to be government. There can be no effective control of corporations, Roosevelt says, while their political activity remains. To put an end to it will be neither a short nor an easy task, but it can be done. And from here on, he lays out the specifics of his agenda. This is what he wants to do. He wants to create government agencies to regulate commerce, to regulate labor, to regulate transportation, to regulate the production of food, to regulate the management and the development of drugs and pharmaceuticals, to control relations between labor and management, to make sure that everybody gets what he calls a square deal. And in order to do this, Roosevelt says, in order to make this work, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to make the case to the people, because only the people can make this happen. We're back to Jefferson's idea and Madison's idea of the people's role as citizens in a republic. We must have, Roosevelt said, complete and effective publicity of corporate affairs. If we want this to work, then we have got to basically take the secrecy out of what corporations do. We must have complete and effective publicity of corporate affairs. The people must know what's going on, so that the people may know beyond peradventure whether the corporations obey the law and whether their management entitles them to the confidence of the public. It is necessary that laws should be passed to prohibit the use of corporate funds directly or indirectly for political purposes. Citizens United 2010, the Supreme Court decision, which justifies unlimited corporate contributions to political campaigns as a category of political speech. Roosevelt is saying it is necessary that laws be passed to prohibit the use of corporate funds directly or indirectly for political purposes. It is still more necessary that such laws should be thoroughly enforced. Corporate expenditures for political purposes, and especially such expenditures by public service corporations, have supplied one of the principal sources of corruption in our political affairs. This gives corporations access to the system that gives them the special privileges that are destroying equality of opportunity for everybody else. This is important because this is Roosevelt's rejection of the populist strategy and this is why I say that progressivism, this kind of progressivism, is an alternative to the radicalism of the Populist Party platform of 1892. Roosevelt says this: it has become entirely clear that we must have government supervision of the capitalization not only of public service corporations, including particularly railways, but of all corporations doing interstate business. I do not wish to see, I've underlined this, I do not wish to see the nation forced into the ownership of the railroads, if it can be possibly avoided. And the only alternative is thoroughgoing and effective legislation which shall be based on a full knowledge of all the facts, including a physical valuation of property, This physical evaluation is not needed, or at least is very rarely needed, for fixing rates, but it is needed as the basis of honest of honest capitalization. What Roosevelt is doing here is rejecting radicalism. He is rejecting ownership of railroads by government. What he is after instead is if railroad companies want to continue to preserve free enterprise, and they want their industry to be privately owned, then they must be willing to subscribe to government oversight and regulation. We're not going to set their rates, Roosevelt says, but we are going to make sure that their capitalization is honest. It is my personal belief, he said, that the same kind and degree of control and supervision which should be exercised over public service corporations should be extended also to combinations which control necessaries of life, such as meat, oil, or coal, or which deal in them on an important scale. In other words, what Roosevelt is saying is everything that the people need is government's business. I believe, Roosevelt says, that the officers, and especially the directors of corporations, should be held personally responsible when any corporation breaks the law. If a corporation breaks the law, the directors go to jail. I give you the recent recession, where nobody's gone to jail. Now he's talking about regulating corporations. I'm just going to use this because, and I'll mention the others rather than go through them all. Combinations, Roosevelt says, combinations in industry are the result of an imperative economic law which cannot be repealed by political legislation. The effort at prohibiting all combinations has substantially failed. This is a criticism of Wilson's position on the New Freedom. We cannot prevent combinations within industry. Corporations are obviously going to get together. Bigness is inevitable, is what he's saying. Combinations in industry are the result of economic laws which we can't repeal. Efforts to prohibitions have failed. The way out lies, he says, not in attempting to prevent such combinations, but in completely controlling them in the interest of the public welfare. For that purpose, the Federal Bureau of Corporations is an agency of first importance. Its powers, and therefore its efficiency, as well as that of the Interstate Commerce Corporation, should be largely increased. We need federal agencies who have power. We have a right to expect from the Bureau of Corporations and from the Interstate Commerce Commission a high grade of public service. We should be as sure of the proper conduct of the interstate railways and the proper management of interstate business as we are now sure of the conduct and management of national banks. And we should have as effective supervision in one case as the other. We have got to have more government power in more areas. We need to regulate more because the alternative is going to destroy our society. Notice the degree to which Roosevelt is creating a defined role for government here as honest broker. His argument is government cannot afford to take sides. Government must make the right decision in the interest of the public. And to do that, we got to get the special interests out of the equation. And then he talks about the tariff. And he's talking about the need to have what he calls an intelligent tariff. And he said, to this end, there must be an expert tariff commission. We need the right people. Then after a paragraph on the tariff, then he goes to and I think this is an important paragraph. The absence of effective state and especially national restraint upon unfair money-getting has tended to create a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men. What Roosevelt is saying here is exactly what we're dealing with today in 2013 in the United States. The absence of effective state and especially national restraint upon unfair money-getting has tended to create a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their own power. The prime need is to change the conditions which enable these men to accumulate power, which it is not for the general welfare that they should hold or exercise. The prime need is to change the conditions which enable these men to accumulate power, which is not for the general welfare that they should hold. We grudge no man a fortune who represents his own power and sagacity when exercised with entire regard to the welfare of his fellows. We don't begrudge people success if what they're doing is achieved while they maintain regard for the welfare of the citizens. Again, comrades over there, take the lesson from your own experience. Not only did you not grudge, but you gloried in the promotion of the great generals who gained their promotion by leading their army to victory. So it is with us. We grudge no man a fortune in civil life if it is honorably obtained and well used. It's not enough that it should have been gained without doing damage to the community. We should permit it to be gained only so long as the gaining represents benefit to the community. This, I know, implies a policy of a far more active governmental interference with social and economic conditions in this country than we have yet had. But I think we've got to face the fact that such an increase in governmental control is now necessary. Our job is not just to make sure that people didn't break the rules, violate the law in acquiring their success. Our job is to make sure that their success benefits everybody else. We've got to find a way to make sure that they give back to the community as a whole. Think about this when you think about, I'm thinking specifically about the last presidential campaign where Mitt Romney was talking about these investments in overseas and offshore banks and all of this in order to avoid interest and taxes. Think about this. What would Roosevelt say about corporations hiding money out of the country in order to avoid taxes and building up such a colossal amount of capital in overseas banks that then they go to government and demand that the penalties against them be reduced in exchange for them bringing this capital back into the country in order to make the economy go? Who suffers in this? What is this doing for working people? Roosevelt then has a paragraph on the guaranteed, what he calls the graduated income tax. The people that make the most ought to pay the most. One little paragraph here I marked as key. He says, the people of the United States suffer from periodic financial panics to a degree substantially unknown to other nations, which approach us in financial strength. There's no reason why we should suffer what they escape. It is of profound importance that our financial system should be promptly investigated and so thoroughly and effectively revised as to make it certain that hereafter our currency will no longer fail at critical times to meet our needs. Basically, what he's saying is, if there is financial setbacks, panics, recessions, depressions, the people who cause it should not be allowed to escape the results. There's no reason why we should suffer what they escape, he says. Personally, I would have liked to have seen Theodore Roosevelt in the White House from 2007 to 2009. When we saw Wall Street and some of these bankers engaged in activities which were incredible, which wiped out people's IRAs, which wiped out the value of their homes. Here we live in a country where since the middle of the 20th century, Americans have been encouraged to borrow, to take out loans to purchase homes, to invest everything they own in their home. Many people in this country, when they reach the age of retirement, the only thing they have, all the wealth they have, is in their home. Can you imagine the injustice of allowing people to engage in financial decision-making on Wall Street and other places, which have the effect of wiping out a third or a half of the value of people's homes, of wiping out the value of everything in their working lives that they've been able to put away? It is absolutely unbelievable. And what we have now is a situation in America where the housing market is beginning to recover. The value of property in some of the target states of the recession, Nevada, Florida, California, etc., some of the places that suffered the greatest declines in property values are now beginning to rebound. Prices of property have gone up 12-15% in some places. So it looks like the recession is ending. It looks like recovery is underway. But if you look at it more carefully, where is this housing activity coming from? Where is it located? What we find is that the people who owned the property at the beginning, in many cases, do not own it now. They've been forced not to sell. Many of them have lost their property. The banks have foreclosed, and they have lost their property, or they just walked away because the value of their property became less than they owe for it. So they are sitting on loans where they owe 50%, 75% more than their property is valued at. So many people have walked away and just violated their obligations to pay this mortgage. And those with money, those people that came through this recession in good shape, who have capital, who have dollars to spend, are buying up much of this property for a song. So what we see in this recovery is not the people who were hurt the most recovering. What we see is property is changing hands. And what we will look back on is one of the greatest transfers of wealth that this nation has ever seen in terms of property and real estate. We persuaded people to put everything they have in their working lives into their homes. And then we sat back and watched these people play investment games, which resulted in the value of their property being diminished by 25%, 30%, 50%, 70%, etc. At the same time, we encouraged people who had fixed retirement incomes under defined benefit pension plans to shift into contribution plans, 401ks, which basically rendered those dollars susceptible to the fiascos that were underway in Wall Street and investment houses. in the financial industry among some of the major banks. And many of those people saw their retirement wiped out as well. And unlike what Roosevelt is talking about here, we are dealing with a government that has done everything that it can do to avoid moving in and doing anything except relying on the same people who caused the problems to fix it. We are doing, effectively, I would suggest to you, the same things to meet. We did the same things to meet this recession that we criticized Herbert Hoover for when he was elected in 1928, because he was unwilling to do what was necessary to meet the depths of the Depression. Hoover's first inkling was to bail out the banks and bail out the corporations, to make sure that the institutions that helped create the problem were strong enough to basically pull us out. And that is effectively what we did recently with the Great Recession. That's not what Roosevelt is talking about here. That's not progressivism. That, I would suggest to you, is the kind of political behavior and the kind of incestuous relationship between the private sector and the public that produced the progressive movement in the first place. But I would suggest to you that before it produced the progressive movement, it produced the populist movement and it produced the Knights of Labor. It produced the kinds of radicalism in the street, which we've seen indications of with the Occupy movement, with the 99 percenters, and these other movements that were basically created and designed to demonstrate the level and the degree of inequality that exists in our society today between those who have and those who don't have. It is the beginning of the kind of popular reaction that existed in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then it became so violent and so extreme that it produced Roosevelt and Wilson and the whole idea of progressivism and the reentry of government. What we have successfully done is we have found a way to move government out of the equation, and we are experiencing the same kind of circumstances that existed then. And I would suggest to you that if things don't change, then what we're looking at down the road is a renewal of progressivism when the pendulum begins to swing that way again. I would suggest that we're probably going to suffer a lot more pain before that happens. But again, progressivism is not the people taking power. Progressivism is what happens when there is a threat that the people are in a position where they might take power. I would suggest to you that if we could reach that point without experiencing the pain and the horror that comes before it, we would be doing a tremendous service for America. The founders would be rolling over in their graves if they heard some of this stuff. It is absolutely an incredible story. It is 59 minutes after the hour. We have completed our time together today. Thank you for listening. I hope that you'll be back tomorrow. I want to go back into progressivism a little bit more tomorrow, but a few more things that I'd like to bring to your attention in Roosevelt's speech. If you get a chance, go on Google, go online, and just Google Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech, and you can read it all. It's fantastic. You heard about 2/3 of it today. Thank you for listening. We'll be back together again tomorrow. Thank you. Be safe.